The tag is sitting on my desk right now, next to the lamp, and I've moved it twice in the last hour, because I don't like where the light falls on it. It's a piece of stamped aluminum about the size of my palm. Site 12, it says. And under that, Hollow Pine Loop. And under that, the district code, which is correct. That's the part I keep coming back to. The district code is right. The font is right. The size of the holes punched for the nails is right. The way the metal is bent at the top left corner, where somebody worked a flat bar behind it and pried it off a post, that's right too. I've pulled 100 of these off old posts in my career when a site got closed. This is real surplus stamping, real aluminum, real weather. 12, maybe 15 winters of weather on it. You can see where the lichen ate into the finish. The trouble is that nobody ever put a post at Site 12 on Hollow Pine Loop, because there is no Hollow Pine Loop, because it was canceled before a single shovel went into the ground. No post, no nails, no tree even, for the tag to come off of. The loop was 8 numbered sites on paper, and nothing else. And the paper got stamped, canceled, 12 years before. 4 people walked in there for a 3-day trip, and 3 of them came out, talking about the picnic table at Site 12, and the stiff latch on the bear box, and the rusty water from the pump. 3 of them came out. The 4th one, a man named Daniel Reyes, walked off toward what he believed was Site 13 to check on people he thought were camped there. And we never found him. Not a boot, not a bone. We found one thing of his, and I'll get to that, because it's the thing that should have ended the official version of this story, and instead got filed as inconclusive. I helped write that official version. I sat in the room. When the report called it confusion from an outdated map, I understood why they reached for that, and I let it stand, because it was a sentence we could defend, and the true sentence had no shape we could put in a folder. I took this tag out of the evidence box before it went to records. I've had it 12 years. I told myself I'd return it. That was a lie I told for a long time, and I'm done telling it, because 3 weeks ago somebody showed me a printout of a new trail planning map, the kind the public can pull up now, and there it was. Hollow Pine Loop. 8 sites, a connector trail, drawn back onto the country like it had always been there. So I'm going to put down what actually happened, in the order it happened, while I can still keep the order straight. I'm better with objects than with feelings, and I'm better with sequence than I used to be. So where I get something out of place, I'll say so. It started for me on a Tuesday in early October, the 2nd week, with a phone call from the incident commander, a man named Frank Doheny. Frank and I had run a lot of searches together by then. He was practical to the point of being blunt, which I valued, because a search is no place for a man who needs to feel things out loud. Frank told me a party of 4 was 40 hours overdue on a loop in the Eastern District, that the trailhead vehicle was confirmed at the lot, and that the families had started calling. He wanted me because I knew the Eastern District better than anyone still drawing a paycheck, or, in my case, still willing to come in off retirement for the day rate. I'd been retired 2 years at that point. I came in more than I should have. A man who's spent his life finding people doesn't stop wanting to, even when his knees have voted against it. The party had filed a trip plan, which I want to note, because it matters later that they did everything right. 4 adults, a 3-day out and back with a loop on the second day, entry and exit at the Cedar Spur trailhead, expected out by Sunday evening. They'd written their intended route on the permit in pen. I have a copy of that permit. The route they drew does not go anywhere near where they ended up. That's not unusual on its own. People wander. But the route they drew also doesn't go anywhere near where they remembered being. And that's a different kind of problem. And it took me a long while to understand the difference. I drove out to Cedar Spur that afternoon, with Frank and a hasty team of 4. The trailhead lot is gravel, washed thin, with a rusted gate that hasn't closed properly since before I retired the first time. Their vehicle was there, a gray crossover, locked, with a parking tag on the dash and a granola wrapper in the cup holder, and nothing wrong with it at all. That's the thing about a found vehicle. It's the most ordinary object in the world, and it's also a clock that's already run out. We did the walk-around, logged the plate, looked in the windows. 2 of the 4 had left jackets in the back seat, the kind of thing you do when you're certain you're coming back to your car. I remember thinking that. Certain. People who are certain leave things behind. We didn't find the group that night. We found them the next morning, and not where we were looking. A pair of grouse hunters with an off-highway permit found 3 of them on an old logging spur, almost 2 miles east of where any of our search probability maps put them. The spur isn't on the current map. It's one of those grades that got bladed in during the timber years, and then left to grow over, and it shows up on the old maps as a thin double dash line with no number. The hunters said the 3 were sitting together against the cut bank, sharing 1 bottle of water, and the first thing one of them said was that they needed to go back for Daniel, because Daniel had gone to the next site over and hadn't come back. The next site over. That was the first time anybody used campsite language, and the hunters didn't think anything of it, because why would they? People camp. The 3 of them clearly hadn't slept anywhere good. They were dehydrated, scraped up, one of them mildly hypothermic. They looked like people who'd spent 2 cold nights out in the open. They did not look like people who'd spent 2 nights at a maintained campsite with a picnic table and a bear box. But that's what they remembered, and they remembered it together, and that contradiction is the whole case. Let me give you the 3 who came back, because they stop being witnesses and start being people once you've sat with them. And I sat with all 3. The one who'd been the planner was a woman named Carol Aldis, 51, a high school geography teacher, which I found out later, and which made a kind of grim sense. She was the one with the paper map, an old USGS quad she'd bought second-hand, because she preferred paper to the apps. She was the most experienced of the 4, had done a lot of backcountry in her younger years, and she'd organized the trip. She was calm when I met her, calmer than the situation called for, and that calm bothered me more than panic would have. She kept describing the campsite as if she were reading it off an inventory. Level tent pad, steel fire ring set in gravel, bear box, the older kind, with the latch you have to lift and turn. Picnic table, with initials carved in the end, she said. Old ones, gone gray. A rules board, with the food storage notice, and the quiet hours notice. A registration box with the slips inside. She listed it like she was confirming a checklist, and when I asked her how she'd found the site, she said they'd seen the sign for Hollow Pine Loop at a junction and followed it because they'd lost the main trail, and a numbered loop meant the Forest Service had been through, and it would tie back to something they could navigate. A numbered loop meant somebody official had been there. That was the logic. That's the logic that gets people killed out here. And I don't say that to be cruel to her. It's just true. We train people their whole lives to trust the brown sign with the white letters. The anxious one was a man named Will Petrakis, 34, Carol's nephew, on his first real backpacking trip. He'd come because Carol had been after him for years to get outside, and because he'd just gone through a divorce and his sister thought it would do him good. He was a mess when I talked to him, and not just from the exposure. He was the one who kept apologizing. He apologized to me, which made no sense, and he apologized to Daniel's family later, which made even less sense, except that I understood it, because that's what guilt does. It looks for somewhere to land. Will remembered the campsite differently from Carol, in one specific way that I held on to. Carol remembered clear nights, cold and starry. Will remembered rain. He remembered lying in the tent listening to rain on the fly. And he remembered the fire ring being too wet the second night to get a fire going. Carol remembered a fire both nights. 2 people in the same camp. 2 different weathers. I wrote that down and underlined it, and didn't know yet what it meant. The third was the skeptic, a man named Greg Tan, 43, an engineer. The kind of detail-minded person who reads the placard on every machine. He and Carol had hiked together before. Greg was the one who'd checked the bear box, physically opened it and put their food in it, and he described the latch with an engineer's precision, the stiffness in the hinge, the way the second mechanism didn't seat right, so you had to push it with your thumb. He remembered the bear box better than he remembered the first night. And Greg was the one who, when I finally pushed him, said the thing that I've never been able to file away. He said the campsite felt too prepared. He said it the way you'd describe a house that's too clean, where you start wondering who keeps it that way. And why. He said the ash in the fire ring was deep, like a lot of people had used it, but the ground around the site had no trail wear, no flattened grass, no path beaten to the toilet, a heavily used fire ring, and an unused ground. He noticed that the first morning, and it nagged at him the whole trip, and he was the one who'd argued they should leave early, and Daniel was the one who'd wanted to stay. So now I had 3 accounts of a campsite, and I had a permit with a route that didn't reach it, and I had a missing man. Frank's first instinct, and it was the right instinct procedurally, was that the group had gotten turned around, found some old illegal campsite, hunkered down, and that Daniel had wandered off in the night and was lying hurt somewhere within a mile of where the other three were found. That gives you a search area. That gives you a point last seen. Sort of. That's a case you can run. So we ran it. We set containment on the logging spur and the 2 drainages that fed off it. We brought in more teams. We got a dog and a handler up from the county, and we started cutting sign east of where the 3 were found. And while the field teams worked, I went to verify the campsite, because I couldn't run a real search until I knew where these people had actually been. And 3 witnesses saying Hollow Pine Loop meant I had to find out what Hollow Pine Loop was. That's when the records started arguing with the people. I knew the name. That was the first strange thing, that the name was familiar to me. Most people on the district wouldn't have known it, but I'd been around long enough to remember when it was a live project. Back in my early years, there'd been a push to put in a small backcountry campground in the Eastern District to take pressure off the lakeshore sites, and Hollow Pine Loop was one of 2 or 3 names that got floated for it. 8 primitive sites, a connector trail, a vault toilet, a hand pump, bear boxes, the works. Modest. The kind of thing that gets drawn up and championed by one ranger, and then dies when that ranger transfers or the money dries up. I called the records office and asked them to pull the project file. The clerk who took my call was a younger woman named Priya Sandoval, who'd been digitizing the old paper archives for a couple of years and knew that basement better than the people who'd filed the stuff originally. She called me back the next day and said she had it, and that I'd want to come look at it in person rather than have her read it over the phone, because there was a lot of it, and some of it was water damaged. I want to be careful here about the order, because this is where my memory wants to compress things, and I've decided I'm not going to let it. I did not go to the archive first. I went to the field first. I spent the second full day of the search out on the ground, because a missing man takes priority over a paper file every single time, and I will not pretend I was clever enough to chase the records early. I wasn't. I was running a search. We searched the canceled footprint that second day, or what I believed was the canceled footprint, working off the old project map Priya had scanned and texted me a rough image of. The proposed loop sat on a bench of ground above a small unnamed pond, the kind of black, still water Greywater has 1,000 of, ringed with drowned timber. The bench was the place the campground was supposed to go, and standing on it, I understood instantly why the project died. The soil was wrong. It was a peaty, unstable ground that wouldn't hold a vault toilet or a foundation, the kind of saturated bench that floods every spring. There was an old access grade coming up to it from the spur, and the grade was washed out in 2 places. Big slumps where the road had simply fallen into the drainage. You couldn't have gotten a truck up there to deliver a bear box if you'd wanted to. The whole place was a monument to why you don't build on bad ground. There was no campground. I want to be plain about that, because everything after depends on it. There was no picnic table, no fire ring, no bear box, no rules board, No registration box, no toilet, no pump, no signposts, no loop trail. There was a bench of wet ground above a black pond, with drowned trees in it, and a washed-out road, and it had clearly been that way for many years. But there were survey stakes. I found the first one almost by accident, my boot catching on it where it stuck up from the moss at the edge of the bench. A wooden survey stake, weathered gray, with the top painted and the paint mostly gone, and a strip of orange flagging tied to it. The flagging was old, sun-bleached, nearly white, brittle. That's normal. Surveyors flag a project. The project dies. The flagging stays for decades, because nobody bothers to pull it. I'd seen 10,000 old survey stakes in my life. I noted it and moved on. And then I found the second one, and the third, and they were laid out in a pattern, and the pattern was a loop. 8 nodes, roughly, spaced the way you'd space campsites, with a line of stakes connecting them like a connector trail. Somebody had staked out hollow pine loop on the ground, which, again, is not strange. You survey before you build. You stake the sites, so the trail crew knows where to put them. The survey would have happened before the cancellation. That's the normal order of things. What stopped me was the flagging on the stake nearest the pond, the one that would have been Site 12, if you numbered them the way the plan numbered them. The other flagging was tied in a simple overhand, the way a tired surveyor ties flagging at the end of a long day. The flagging on that one stake was tied in a clove hitch. Neat, deliberate, 2 clean turns. A clove hitch on a survey stake is a particular thing. It's not how you flag a line. It's how somebody who cares about knots ties off. And I'd seen that exact knot before. In this forest. On other stakes. In cases I'm not going to get into here. Except to say they were cases that also never resolved cleanly. I stood there and looked at that clove hitch for a long time, and I told myself a surveyor with a Navy background had tied it 40 years ago, and I almost believed it. I logged the stakes. I photographed them. I marked the bench on my map, and then I made the first of my mistakes, and I want to own it cleanly, because it cost time we didn't have. I decided the stakes were old. The footprint was empty, and therefore Daniel could not be there, because there was nothing there to draw him. I redirected the dog team away from the bench and back to the drainages, on the theory that a man who wandered at night from the logging spur would have followed water downhill, which is what lost people do. It's good doctrine. It's what I'd have told a class of trainees to do. And it was wrong, because it assumed Daniel had been on the spur, when in his own mind, in whatever was happening in his mind, he'd been at Site 12 and had walked toward Site 13, and Site 13, if it was anywhere, was on that bench. I pulled the search off the one place the witnesses were pointing me toward. I did it for good reasons. That's the part I can't forgive. The next day I went to the archive, because the field search was producing nothing, and Priya had been firm that I needed to see the file. The records basement in the district headquarters is a low room with metal shelving and a dehumidifier that runs constantly and never quite wins. Priya had the project box out on a table, and it was a banker's box gone soft at the corners from a flood they'd had down there years back, before the digitizing, the kind of flood that took out a lot of the older paper. The label on the box was handwritten, and the name had been struck through once and rewritten, which I noticed and didn't ask about. Inside was the hollow pine loop project file, or what was left of it. I'm going to tell you what was in that box, because it's where the case stopped being a confused hiker's case and became something I couldn't explain. There was the development proposal, dated, with a cover memo from a district ranger whose name I recognized, a man long dead. There was an environmental review, partially legible, that flagged the soil instability and the seasonal flooding and recommended against the site. There was a budget worksheet. There was a procurement list. The procurement list is important, so I'll be specific. It listed everything the campground was to receive. 8 bare boxes of a specified model, 8 steel fire rings, 8 picnic tables, site number posts and tags, a hand pump, a vault toilet unit, a rules board, registration boxes. Next to each line item was a status column, and the status column, for every single item, said the same thing. Not ordered, not delivered, canceled prior to procurement. The cancellation memo was in there too, stamped, with a date, 12 years before the hikers walked in. Budget reallocation, it said, and access road washout, and unresolved boundary survey discrepancy. That last phrase made me stop. Unresolved boundary survey discrepancy. I'd never heard of a campground being canceled over a survey discrepancy. So the records were clear. Nothing was ever ordered. Nothing was ever delivered. Nothing was ever built. The procurement column was an unbroken row of canceled. And I sat there in that humming basement, with that procurement list in my hand, and I thought, well, that settles it. The campsite is not real. The hikers are confused, and I'll have to find a gentle way to tell 3 traumatized people and 1 grieving family that the place they remember does not exist. Then Priya put the survey sheets in front of me. The survey sheets were the part of the file that had survived the flood best, because they'd been in a separate sleeve. They were the surveyor's working drawings for the loop, the staking plan, with each site located and numbered. And on the staking plan for Site 12, in the margin, the surveyor had made a note. Surveyors make notes. They note a big rock that's in the way, a tree that has to come down, a spring that needs to be routed around. The note on Site 12 read, "Existing fire scar and ring of stones. Native. Predates survey. Recommend incorporate as fire ring location." And next to it, the surveyor had sketched a little rectangle and labeled it table, with an arrow, and a second note. Flat bench here suitable for table. Old initials in adjacent snag. Advise retain snag. old initials in adjacent snag. Carol had described initials carved into the end of the picnic table, old ones, gone gray. The picnic table that was never delivered. But the surveyor, decades earlier, had noted old initials in a dead tree at the spot where the table would have gone. The hikers couldn't have seen this file. It was in a flood-damaged box in a locked basement. Carol was a geography teacher, not an archive clerk. There was no public version of this. And yet the detail she'd given me, initials, old, at the table, matched a note made by a man who died before she ever picked up a backpack. I asked Priya if the survey sheets had ever been scanned or shared, if there was any path by which a member of the public could have seen them. She said no. She said she'd scanned them herself the previous year, and they'd never left the system, and that before her, they'd been in the box, in the flood, untouched since the cancellation. She'd noticed the same thing I had. That's why she'd wanted me there in person. She'd read the survivor statements I'd filed, and she'd matched the initials note on her own, and it had unsettled her enough that she didn't want to be the one to say it out loud over a phone line. I went back to the survivors after that, separately, the way you're supposed to, so they don't contaminate each other. And I stopped trying to talk them out of the campsite and started letting them describe it in full, because now I needed every detail, and the details are where this gets bad. Carol I sat with at her kitchen table. She'd recovered physically. She had her paper map out, the old quad, and she showed me where she thought they'd been, and her finger landed on the bench above the black pond, the cancelled footprint, which she had no way of knowing was the cancelled footprint. She traced how they'd lost the main trail in a stretch of blowdown, how they'd been casting around for the route when Will spotted the junction sign. A brown wooden sign, she said, routed letters, white paint, hollow pine loop, with an arrow, and under it the universal tent symbol and a number, a half-mile. She said it looked weathered but maintained. She said it was the most ordinary sign in the world, and that's exactly why they followed it. I asked her to draw it. She drew a standard Forest Service trail sign. It was correct in every particular. The proportions, the bevel on the post, the way the arrow's done. A geography teacher might know that. I noted it anyway. She walked me through the 2 nights. The level tent pad, the fire ring with deep, cold ash. She remembered Greg checking the bear box and grumbling about the latch. She remembered the registration box. And here's a thing she said that I sat with for a long time. She said she'd filled out a registration slip. There was a pad of them in the box, she said. The carbon kind. Fill it out. Tear off your copy. Drop the rest in the slot. And she'd filled one out, the first night, with the 4 of their names, and the date, and their permit number. And she dropped it in the slot, because that's what you do. Because the box says, registration goes in the box. She did it on autopilot, she said. The way you sign a guest book. And she said the strange thing was that when she'd opened the pad to fill out her slip, the slip above hers, the last one anybody had torn off, was already filled in handwriting, with a date. and she didn't look at it closely because why would you? But the date, she thought, was wrong. The date was old. She remembered thinking, in passing, "That's a strange year." And then she filled out her own and forgot about it until I asked. A strange year. I asked her if she could remember the year. She couldn't. She thought it was decades back. She'd glanced at it and dismissed it the way you dismiss a wrong date on a form. Names from different decades in the same registration box. I'll come back to that, because I found the box, or I found what was left of the place the box would have been. Will I sat with at his sister's house, with his sister hovering, because he wasn't doing well. Will gave me the rain. He was adamant about the rain. He described the sound of it on the fly. The way the second night the whole site smelled of wet canvas and cold ash. The way they couldn't get a fire and ate cold food. He described being scared, not of anything specific, just the low animal fear of being somewhere unfamiliar in the dark. And he described Daniel trying to talk him down. Daniel telling him it was a real campsite. Look, there's a bear box, there's a fire ring. Somebody maintains this place. We're fine. Will said Daniel kept pointing at the infrastructure as proof they were safe. The bear box means it's safe. The number means it's safe. And Will said, the thing that I think about most, of everything any of them told me. He said that around the second night, he started to hear the other campsite. He hadn't heard it the first night. The second night, with the rain, he heard it through the trees. A cooler lid closing. That hollow plastic thunk. Somebody splitting kindling. The regular crack of it. And once, a kid laughing. He said there was a child laughing at the next site over, and he remembered being comforted by it, because a family with a kid meant it was the kind of place families went, the kind of place that was safe. He fell asleep comforted by the sound of a child at a campsite that was never built. Greg I met at a diner, his choice, somewhere public and well lit, which told me something about how he was handling it. Greg had no use for comfort. He gave me angles and measurements. He'd checked the bear box, he'd checked the fire ring, and he'd checked, he said, the rules board, because he reads everything, and the rules board bothered him. The notices on it were the standard ones: food storage, quiet hours, pack it in, pack it out. But there was a fee notice, he said, a small sign about the nightly fee and where to deposit it, and the fee on it was wrong. It was too low. It was an old fee, the kind of fee the Forest Service charged decades ago. He'd noticed it and thought, this place hasn't updated its signs in a long time, and filed it under poorly maintained. And he'd noticed the thing he told me first, the deep ash in an unworn site. And he'd noticed one more thing that he saved for last, and that he was almost embarrassed to say. He said the site number post, the one with the tag, Site 12, was new. Not new like installed yesterday. New like the post was sound and the tag was legible, while everything else, the table, the board, the box, was weathered to gray. An old campsite with one new post. He'd thought it had been replaced, after a tree fell on the old one. People replace posts. It's the most boring explanation in the world. And it's the post that tag on my desk came off of. Except that no post was ever installed. Except that Greg saw it, and Carol saw it, and Will saw it, and one of them, or all of them, walked past it on the way to a campsite that the United States government had canceled before any of them owned a backpack. Here's where I have to put Daniel in properly, because by now in the telling he's been the missing one, the absence, and he was a person, and his being a person is why this still keeps me up. Daniel Reyes was 38. He was Greg's friend, originally. The two of them had met through a climbing gym, and he'd been brought onto the trip as the fourth, the easygoing one who got along with everybody. He was an experienced hiker, more than Will, less than Carol, comfortable in the backcountry, the kind of competent that doesn't make a show of itself. His strength, everyone agreed, was that he was steady. He didn't panic. When the group lost the trail in the blowdown, Daniel was the one who kept everybody calm. When Will was scared, Daniel talked him down. He believed in the campsite more than any of them. And I think that's the cruelty of it. Because Daniel's steadiness, the very thing that made him good in the woods, is what kept him there. He looked at the bear box and the fire ring and the number, and he read them the way we're all trained to read them, as evidence of order, as proof that someone official had been here and made this place safe. His weakness, if you want to call it that, the same trait turned around, was that he trusted infrastructure more than he trusted his own unease. Greg wanted to leave because the place felt too prepared. Daniel wanted to stay because the place was prepared. Same observation, opposite conclusion. The steady man stayed. On the third morning, the morning they were supposed to be hiking out, the rain had stopped, by Will's account, or there'd never been rain, by Carol's, and the group was breaking camp, and Daniel said he was going to walk over to Site 13 before they left. Why? I asked, all three of them, separately. Why would he go to Site 13? And their answers didn't match, which is itself the pattern. Carol said he wanted to check the registration box at 13 because they were going to report the site as unmaintained, and he wanted the loop's full information. Will said Daniel had heard the people at 13 packing up and wanted to ask them about the trail out, since the four of them were still turned around. Greg said Daniel had said the people at 13 had called over to them, that someone at the next site had called out something about the trail, and Daniel had gone to answer. 3 reasons: a registration box, directions, a voice, 1 man, 3 reasons to walk toward a campsite that wasn't there. He told them he'd be 10 minutes. He walked off down the connector trail toward 13, and he didn't come back. And here's the part that the other 3 agree on completely, the one detail that's identical across all 3 accounts, which is rare in this case, and which is why I trust it. They waited. They got worried. They went after him, and the connector trail to Site 13 didn't go to a Site 13. It looped. It brought them back to Site 12. They walked the trail to the next site, and it returned them to their own camp. And they did it again, twice more, all three of them together, calling his name, and every time the trail to 13 delivered them back to 12. And then, Carol said, the campsite was gone, not vanished in a flash. She said it more carefully than that. She said that the third or fourth time the trail looped them back, the camp they returned to was just the bench. The table was gone. The box was gone. The fire ring was a scatter of native stones. The post was gone. They were standing on wet ground above a black pond with their own packs sitting in the dirt, and no campsite around them, and no Daniel. And they understood, all three at once, that they had to get out, and they ran, and they got lost, and they spent 2 nights in the open, which is the part the records can explain, before the hunters found them on the spur. That's the account. 3 people, 2 nights of comfort, at a place that doesn't exist, and then the place letting go of them, and 1 man not let go of. Now I'll tell you what the search found, because we kept searching, and we found one thing, and the one thing is the worst object in this whole case, worse than the tag, and I'm the reason it didn't matter. After the archive, I went back to the bench, this time with the dog and the handler and a small team, because now I understood, too late, that the bench was the place, that the witnesses' fingers had all landed on it, that Site 13, if Daniel walked toward it, was somewhere on that loop of survey stakes above the pond. The handler was a woman named Brenda Cho, County SAR, very good, and her dog was a good dog. And I want to be fair to both of them about what happened up there because it wasn't their failure. The dog worked the bench, and worked it well, until it got to the stake I'd noted, the one with the clove hitch, the Site 12 stake nearest the pond. And there the dog quit. Not dramatically. It didn't bark or cower. It just stopped working, sat down, and looked at Brenda, and would not take the scent past a certain line. Brenda worked it 3 times. 3 times the dog came to the same line and sat. Brenda told me, quietly, that she'd seen dogs refuse before, usually water or a strong distraction, but that this was different, that the dog wasn't scared and wasn't distracted. It was just done, like the trail it was on, simply ended in the air. She marked the line. I marked the line. The line ran right through where Site 12 would have been. And on the far side of that line, maybe 30 feet on, in the moss at the base of a dead snag, we found Daniel's mug. It was an enamel camp mug, blue, chipped at the rim, and it was sitting upright on the moss, level, full of clean rainwater, upright, level, full. As if someone had set it down on a table, and the table had gone away, and left the mug hanging in the position the table held it. The moss under it was undisturbed. There was no sign anyone had walked to that spot. No boot print, no crushed vegetation, no path, and the dog would not go to it. Brenda had to glove up and retrieve it from the line, because the dog would not cross. It was Daniel's mug. Greg identified it. It had a strip of green tape on the handle, with Daniel's initials in marker, the way you mark your gear, so it doesn't get mixed up at a group camp. DR, in Daniel's own hand. That mug was the closest we ever came to Daniel Reyes. An upright mug of rainwater in undisturbed moss, 30 feet past a line a dog wouldn't cross, at the foot of a dead snag that a surveyor decades earlier had noted contained old carved initials. We searched that bench and the pond and the drainages for 9 more days. We brought in more dogs and more teams, and a drone with a thermal camera. We dragged the shallow end of the pond. We found nothing else. Not a thread. A steady, competent, well-liked man walked 10 minutes to the next campsite, and the only thing the world kept of him was a mug that stood up by itself. I want to be honest about the snag, because it's where I made my worst call. When I stood at that dead snag and looked for the old initials the surveyor had noted, I found them, carved into the gray wood, weathered nearly smooth, 2 sets, old. And below them, lower on the trunk, fresher, the bark edges of the cut still pale, 2 more letters, D and R. I am not going to dress that up. I saw fresh initials on the snag, and they matched the dead man's tape. And I stood there, and I made a decision in about 4 seconds that I've had 12 years to regret. I did not log it. I did not photograph it. I told myself a searcher had done it, that somebody on one of the teams had carved his initials there as a marker, which would be against every protocol but which people do. And I told myself that putting an unexplainable carving into the record would not help find Daniel, and would only invite the kind of scrutiny that gets a case taken away from the people who actually care about it. So I left it out. I left the Fresh D.R. on the snag out of the file. And then, because I am apparently a man who has to make the same mistake twice in the same place, I pried the Site 12 tag off the post. Except there was no post. I keep saying that, and I'll say it once more, because it's the center of everything. When we found the mug, and I went to the snag, the campsite was not there. There was no table, no box, no fire ring, no post, no tag. The bench was empty, the way it had been every other time I'd stood on it. The tag on my desk did not come off a post on that bench, because there was no post on that bench. It was in my coat pocket. I have to back up, because this is the thing I've never told anyone, and the reason I'm recording this at all. The morning we found the mug, before the dog, before Brenda, before the team got up the grade, I'd gone up to the bench alone at first light. I do that. I get to a search area early and walk it alone before the noise starts, to read the ground when it's quiet. And that morning, in the fog, before the sun burned it off, the bench was not empty. I came up the grade, and there was a junction sign at the top, brown, routed letters, white paint, hollow pine loop, with an arrow. There was a connector trail, beaten into the ground, where there had been no trail the day before, and down the trail, through the fog, there was a campsite, a level pad, a picnic table, a steel fire ring with a thread of smoke still rising off cold ash, the way ash smokes in the morning damp. a bear box, a rules board, a registration box on a post, and a site number post with a metal tag on it that said Site 12, Hollow Pine Loop, and the correct district code. I stood at the edge of it in the fog for what was probably a minute, and felt like an hour. Everything in me that had spent 40 years in these woods told me to walk into that campsite and look for Daniel. Because if the campsite was real, then Site 13 was real, and Daniel was down the connector trail. And everything else in me, the part that had read the procurement list with its unbroken column of canceled, knew that there was no campsite, that I was looking at a place that had only ever existed on paper, and that the surest way to join Daniel was to walk down that connector trail into the fog, looking for the next site. I did not walk in. I want that on the record too, because I've spent 12 years not knowing whether that was wisdom or cowardice, and I still don't know. I stood at the edge, and I did not go in, but I reached out, because the site number post was right there at the junction, an arm's length inside the line, and I took hold of the tag, and I worked it back and forth, and the nails gave, and I pried it off the post and put it in my coat pocket. I took one object out of that place. I don't fully know why. I think I needed proof, for myself, that I hadn't imagined it. I think I needed to take something real out of an unreal place, so that later, when the report called it confusion, I'd have a piece of aluminum in my drawer that said otherwise. And then the fog moved, the way fog does, a thinning and a drift, and the campsite was the bench again. The sign was gone, the trail was gone, the table and the box and the fire ring were gone. I was standing at the edge of an empty bench above a black pond, with my hand in my coat pocket, around a piece of metal that had a number on it, for a site that was never built. The dog refused that bench an hour later. The mug stood up in the moss, 30 feet past the line. And I never told a soul that I'd taken the tag off a post that wasn't there, because there is no version of that sentence that survives an incident review. The official explanation came together over the following weeks, and I'm not going to pretend I fought it, because I didn't, and the not fighting is its own confession. Frank ran the incident the way Frank ran everything, by what could be substantiated. And here's the thing I came to understand about Frank and about all of them. They weren't lying, and they weren't covering anything up in the way people mean when they say cover up. They were doing the only honest thing the system allows, which is to write down what can be defended. The hikers got lost in blowdown. That's substantiated. The blowdown is real and on the map. They sheltered somewhere for 2 nights. That's substantiated. They were found dehydrated and hypothermic. One member separated from the group and was lost. That's substantiated. We have the mug, sort of. We have the point last seen, sort of. And the campsite? The campsite is 3 exposure-stressed witnesses describing a place that records prove does not exist. So the campsite became, in the report, an outdated map error. The theory was that Carol's old paper quad showed the proposed loop. that she'd seen Hollow Pine Loop printed on her second-hand map, and that the group, lost and cold, had convinced themselves they'd reached it, and that the shared memory was a trauma response. 3 frightened people stitching a comforting story out of an old map label. It's a good explanation. I want to be fair to it. It's the kind of explanation I'd have reached for myself if I hadn't stood at the edge of that campsite in the fog. There was only one problem with it, beyond the ones I was keeping in my coat pocket and my own memory, and the problem was the map. I checked Carol's map, the old second-hand quad. I held it in my own hands. Hollow Pine Loop is not on it. The proposed loop was never printed on a public map because it was canceled before it ever made it to a published edition. Carol's map showed the bench, showed the black pond, showed the old access grade as a thin dashed line, and showed nothing called Hollow Pine Loop because no map ever did. The outdated map explanation requires the name to have been on a map. It wasn't on any map. I told Frank this. I told the group that wrote the report this. And the report, in its final form, said that the survivors may have seen the proposed loop referenced on an older or unofficial map. Source unconfirmed. May have. Source unconfirmed. That's how you handle a fact that breaks your explanation. You don't deny it. You soften it into a maybe, and you move on. Because the report has to close. And a report cannot close on the sentence the campsite did not exist, but they slept in it anyway. I understood why they did it. I want to keep saying that because it's the part people get wrong about how these things happen. Nobody in that room was a villain. They were professionals, choosing the explanation they could put their name to without lying. And the true explanation could not be put to paper because it had no form a paper could hold. The procurement list went into the file. The survey sheets, with the surveyor's note about the initials, did not, because Priya was instructed that flood-damaged peripheral documents weren't germane to a missing person determination, and the note about old initials in a snag is exactly the kind of thing that looks like nothing until you know about Carol's table. The survey stakes were noted in passing, and then, later, quietly pulled, because the district decided the area was a hazard, unstable soil, and a washed-out road, and closed it under resource protection language, and sent a crew to remove the old flagging and stakes so nobody would follow them up there. I helped recommend that closure. I told myself it was to keep people away from a dangerous bench. It was also, and I knew it was also, to remove the only physical evidence that Hollow Pine Loop had ever been staked on the ground. The mug was logged, the mug was real, and it was Daniel's, and there was no softening it, so it went into the record as recovered personal effect, found at, and then a grid coordinate, and the coordinate they used was not where we found it. They moved it, not far. They moved Daniel's last known point off the bench and onto the logging spur, to a defensible location, a place where a lost man plausibly could have ended up, because recovered at the foot of a snag 30 feet past a line a dog would not cross is not a sentence the system can hold, and recovered along the spur is. I sat in the room when that coordinate was chosen. I did not object. Daniel's family was told their son's last known location was the spur, and they searched the spur in their grief for years, on their own, off-season, because I had helped move the only marker we had of him to a place he had never been. That's the guilt. It's not that I saw something I can't explain. Lots of men have seen things they can't explain. It's that I had 3 chances to put the truth into the record. The fresh initials on the snag. The tag I pried off a post that wasn't there. The real coordinate of the mug. And 3 times, I chose the defensible version over the true one. And the defensible version sent a family to grieve in the wrong place for 12 years. I told them their son got lost. I let them believe the woods were just woods. I knew better, and I let them believe it, because the truth would have cost me my credibility, and the case its closure. And a man tells himself those are noble reasons, right up until he's old, and recording his own voice in an empty house at night. I went back up to the bench one more time, that fall, alone, after the search was suspended and the closure was signed. I told myself I was checking the stake removal crew's work. That was a lie, too. I went up to see if it would come back. I went up at first light, in the fog, the way it had been the morning of the mug, and I stood at the top of the grade where the junction sign had been, and I waited. It did not fully come back. I want to be honest about that, because I could tell you a better story than the one that happened, and I'm not going to. There was no campsite. The bench was empty, the stakes pulled, the flagging gone. The crew had done their work. But at the spot where the registration box had been, on its post, there was a single registration slip lying on the moss. One of the carbon kind, the duplicate slip you tear off and keep. It was damp, but legible, and on it was written, in a hand I did not recognize, the names of 4 people, and a date, and a permit number. The 4 names were Carol Aldis, Will Petrakis, Greg Tan, and Daniel Reyes. The date on the slip was the first night of their trip. The permit number was correct. It was the slip Carol told me she'd filled out and dropped in the box. The slip she filled out on autopilot, the way you sign a guest book. Except Carol had dropped hers in the slot. And this was the duplicate, the keeper copy, the one you're supposed to take with you. And none of them had taken a keeper copy, because none of them, when they ran, were thinking about paperwork. The campsite kept its copy. The registration goes in the box, and the box keeps a record. And the box had kept a record of 4 hikers signing in on a night they slept at a place that was never built. And 12 years later, I am the only one who knows that the system that filed Hollow Pine Loop as a canceled plan was not the only system keeping records up there. I took that slip too. It's in the drawer with the tag. I've looked at it maybe a dozen times in 12 years. The names don't fade. I want to tell you, the names fade, because that would make it a normal piece of old paper, but they don't. If anything, the ink looks fresher now than it did, and I've stopped looking at it closely, because I don't want to confirm whether that's true. And here's the last of it. Here's why I'm recording this now. after 12 years of keeping it in a drawer and telling myself it was over. 3 weeks ago, a young ranger came to see me, new to the district, eager, the kind of green I used to be. She'd been assigned to review old closures in the Eastern District because they're updating the public-facing trail maps, the digital ones, the ones anybody can pull up on a phone now. And she'd found a closure she couldn't make sense of, a bench above an unnamed pond, closed under resource protection language. No trail on it, no reason on the public side for it to be flagged. And she'd pulled the old project file to understand it, and found my name in it. And she came to ask me, professional to professional, retired ranger to new one, what Hollow Pine Loop had been, because she said, and these were her words, the new map is showing it. I asked her what she meant. She said that when the new trail layer had gone live the week before, for about a day, Hollow Pine Loop had appeared on it. 8 numbered sites, a connector trail, a label. She'd screenshotted it because it didn't match any of the records, and she'd wanted to flag the error. By the time she went to file the correction, it was gone from the map, and the IT people said there was no record of that data ever being in the system. No edit, no source layer, nothing. And they thought she'd made a mistake. But she had the screenshot. She showed me the screenshot. Hollow Pine Loop, 8 sites, on a map that the people who maintain the map say never contained it. And she'd come to me because my name was the one she recognized from the old file. And she wanted to know, before she let it go as a glitch, the way her supervisors wanted her to, whether there was anything she should know. I looked at that screenshot a long time. I looked at Site 12 on it, sitting on the bench above the black pond, with a little tent symbol next to it like an invitation. And I almost told her it was a glitch. I had the sentence ready. It's an old canceled project. Sometimes legacy data surfaces. Don't worry about it. Close it out. The defensible sentence, the one that closes the file and protects everybody, and sends another person away, believing the woods are just woods. I had it right there in my mouth. 12 years of practice behind it. I didn't say it. I'm too old to send one more person up that grade with a clean conscience and an empty map. I told her not to put it back on the map. I told her if anyone reports a trail junction sign for Hollow Pine Loop, or a campsite on that bench, or a Site 12, she is to keep people off it, and never, under any circumstances, follow a connector trail toward a Site 13. I didn't explain why, because I don't have a why that would survive her telling it to her supervisor. I just told her, and I watched her decide whether the old man in front of her was worth believing, and I couldn't tell which way she landed. And that's its own kind of horror, watching someone make the exact calculation I made about a senior ranger, 12 years too late. After she left, I got the tag out of the drawer. I do that sometimes. And I want to end on this, because it's the only thing I have left that's both true and unfillable. And unfillable is the whole story of my career. When I pried that tag off the post in the fog 12 years ago, the bottom edge was clean, stamped, weathered, but the bottom edge below the district code was smooth aluminum, I'd have sworn to it. I logged it in my own memory, the way you log evidence, and the bottom edge was smooth. There are scratches on it now, fresh ones, bright in the weathered metal, the kind of marks a tag gets from being worked back and forth against a nail. Below the district code, where the edge was smooth, somebody has scratched 2 letters into the aluminum. They're crude, the way you'd scratch initials into metal with a knife point, or a stake. A D and an R. It's been in my drawer the whole time. There's no post on that bench. The crew pulled the stakes. The campsite was never built. That part was never in dispute. But Daniel signed the register, and the box kept the copy. And somewhere up on a bench of bad ground above a black pond, on a loop that exists only on a map that appears for 1 day at a time, there is a Site 13, with the lid of a cooler closing, and a child laughing, and a fire ring smoking in the morning damp, and a steady, competent man who walked 10 minutes to check on the neighbors, and I am the one who told his mother he just got lost. I don't know what's up there. I've never claimed to. I'm a practical man, or I was. I know what the records say, and I know what I saw in the fog, and I know those 2 things have never agreed, and never will. The Forest Service closed the bench and pulled the stakes and softened the report, and chose the sentence it could defend, and I helped. And I'd probably help again, because the true sentence still has nowhere to live. But I kept the tag. I think now that I kept it for the same reason Daniel walked toward the voices, because a number on a piece of official metal makes a place feel real, and feeling real is the oldest trap there is. And the only difference between us is that I stopped at the edge and he didn't, and I've spent 12 years pretending that difference was wisdom. The scratches weren't there when I put it in the drawer. I'm certain of that. I'm certain of it the way I was certain the 4 of them would come back to their car, because they left their jackets. Because people who are certain leave things behind. I'm going to put the tag back in the drawer now, and I'm not going to look to see if there's a 3rd letter.